The Astronauts continued by Stanislaw Lem. Translated from the German by the Spirit of Hegel. The planet Venus. Midnight was over. The commission meeting had already lasted 7 hours. On the tables lay entire stacks of drawings, charts, and film strips. When the members of the astronomical section entered the room, the attendants fell silent. Everyone looked at Arseniev, Chandrasekhar, and Lao Tzu, but nothing could be determined from their expressions. Followed by a number of staff and assistants, they went to their seats. When Arseniev announced the result of the calculations, there was a profound silence. "So it's Venus?" someone in the room asked. Arseniev didn't answer. He sat down and spread out the papers he had brought with him. "Isn't there a possibility of error?" asked the same voice at the biologist's table. Lecturer Sturdy, a small man with a red face and bushy hair, had asked the questions. "The electronic brain can make a mistake here and there," replied Arseniev. "However, on average, only one error occurs every 6 trillion calculations. But we are considering this possibility and will repeat the calculations tonight." "I wasn't thinking about that," insisted the biologist. "I'm concerned with the theoretical foundations of the calculations. Couldn't there be an error in that?" Arseniev smoothed the papers in front of him with both hands. He was one of the most distinctive persons on the commission. Light blonde, enormous, with slightly stooped shoulders. He seemed to be built according to the long-lost proportions of noble excess. By his 30th year, he had already completed his major work, which explained a series of ultra-atomic phenomena through a new theory. Arseniev was now 37 years old. Even while sitting, he still towered over his neighbors by a head. He gazed at his opponents for a while in silence, as if preparing a detailed rebuttal. A slight shudder ran through everyone when Arseniev spoke a single word in his deep voice. "No, Professor Klueva," a Leipzig biologist who was chairing the meeting that day, suggested that one of the astronomers inform the non-expert everything about the planet Venus that was related to the problem under discussion. The suggestion was accepted. After a brief deliberation, the section of astrophysicists elected Dr. Behrens, who immediately rose from his seat and switched on the microphone. He was still a youthful man, almost boyish in appearance, slim, almost gaunt, with jerky movements. During his lecture he played with his glasses and, as is the case with nearsighted people, looked around uncertainly. Arseniev, who had been whispering with some colleagues in the meantime, leaned his gigantic figure over the armrest of the chair and gave his assistants some instructions, which they took down in shorthand. Then they walked away on tiptoe. Although everyone present was listening attentively to Dr. Behrens, a sense of unrest was palpable in the room. Heads were tilted toward one another, and whispers were heard here and there. Meanwhile, the young astronomer spoke to the assembled group, while his speech was automatically translated into foreign languages. "Venus," he began, "the second planet in our solar system, has a diameter 3% smaller and a mass 23% less than Earth. Since it is always close to the sun in the sky, it is a thankless object for observation. Its distance from us varies between 250 kilometers at its greatest distance from Earth and 40 million kilometers at its closest." Here Dr. Behrens looked slightly suspiciously at the linguists. He wasn't sure if they would understand the astronomical terms. The grey-haired scholars, however, were listening with such attention that he feared disturbing them with further explanations. He continued, "According to the latest research, one day on Venus is 18 Earth days, which means its rotational speed is 18 times slower than that of the Earth. Venus is accompanied by tremendous hurricanes and thunderstorms. The wind there can reach a speed of 250 kilometers per hour, a speed encountered on Earth only during the most violent snowstorms near the South Pole. Unfortunately, we cannot provide our colleagues with anything definite about the planet's surface structure. Jellington and Schrager recently published a very interesting paper on the subject. They assume that the solid crust of Venus could be composed of a material that is man-made product here on Earth, namely a plastic mass similar to Galilathan vinolite. I am sharing this with my esteemed colleagues as a kind of curiosity, but we possess no evidence to support such a hypothesis. Dr. Behrens had sat down again with an awkward bow. When Lecturer Sturdy, who had previously questioned Arseniev about the possibility of an error in the calculations, asked for the floor. Dr. Behrens' lecture completely confirmed my reservations, he said. It is obvious that the physical conditions expressed therein, especially the lack of oxygen and water, as well as the presence of clouds, which practically turn this planet into a formalin reservoir, rule out any possibility of existence, and thus also the presence of living beings. Dr. Behrens, you are of the same opinion, aren't you? Dr. Behrens took off his glasses again and cleaned them carefully. Then he replied to Sturdy. Towards the end of the 19th century, an eminent scholar wrote a highly logical constructed treatise in which he proved that man could never be able to build an aircraft heavier than air, and that even if its construction were successful, such an aircraft could never detach itself from Earth. Even if it did, which in itself would be completely impossible, contrary to all assumptions, rise into the air, even then there would be no way of steering it. Because Dr. Behrens concluded, I don't want to resemble this scholar. I prefer not to answer the lecturer's question. The toxic atmosphere of Venus excludes any life. Sturdy bridled. Instead of dealing with anecdotes, it would be better to go down to the facts. To get down to the facts. The fact is that almost 100 years ago, a space rocket fell to Earth, which, as Professor Chandrasekhar demonstrated, contained no living beings. His neighbor interrupted. Good, agreed. But the rocket couldn't have come from Venus because then there would have to be designers, meaning living beings, inhabiting this planet. That's obvious. For a while, only the accelerated asthmatic breathing of the old biologist could be heard in all his head. And then, furrowing his thick eyebrows, Arseniev said briefly and firmly, for the second time since the consultation had begun, No. He looked at the astonished lecturer calmly and added, That is not self-evident. There was so much emphasis and certainty in Arseniev's voice that the scholars froze for a few seconds before the image he conjured, the image of an incomprehensible, uncanny world in which thinking, creative, and yet dead beings existed. The chairman, Professor Kluev, stood up, looked first to one side of the room, then to the other, and raised his hand. Dear colleagues, an urgent motion has just been made to submit these questions to the plenary session of the Translation Commission, which are to be discussed separately. First, can one assume that the unknown beings are aiming to destroy life on Earth? Second, under such a premise, can one assume that humanity is actually threatened by this danger? Third, if that is the case, what can we do about it? Lecturer Dragradze from the logicians section asked for the floor. I'm of the opinion, he explained, that only the first question can be decided by vote, since it concerns our beliefs more than the facts. We are too ignorant of the language of the report to be completely certain of the correct interpretation of the passage that speaks of a so-called invasion of Earth. Since we do not know the truth exactly, we must rely on conjecture, and therefore we can all express our opinions on this subject. The other questions, however, cannot be decided in this way, just as one cannot decide by vote whether the roof of this building is made of glass or metal. To determine this, one would have to ask the architect who built it. These are facts known only to specialists, so the specialists must take care of this matter. The logician's proposal was accepted. Since the room was equipped with special equipment, the vote proceeded extraordinarily quickly. Each of those present had 3 buttons on his desk in front of him. Pressing the left one meant yes, the right one meant no. Pressing the middle one meant abstention. When the chairman gave the signal to vote, everyone reached out for the buttons, and after just a few seconds, an automatic display displayed the results. Of the 76 members of the commission, 68 answered the first question with yes, and 2 with no. 6 abstained. It was a characteristic fact that the abstentions came exclusively from the logicians. The overwhelming majority, therefore, held the view that the ominous section of the report spoke of an intended invasion of Earth. After the vote was announced, the chairman adjourned further debate until the evening of the following day. By that time, a committee was to be found to draft the answers to the second and third questions. The astrophysicists, atomic physicists, chemists, technologists, and engineers immediately formed a special section which conferred on the institutes. At the institute's small hall all night long until 11 o'clock in the morning, only then did its members retire to attend the general meeting at 10 o'clock in the evening. That evening, Professor Lao Tzu reported on the work of the special section. Clear signs of the sleeplessness were evident in the faces of his colleagues. He alone looked his usual self, in his ill-fitting dark suit and his tightly combed black hair. Before I address the main problem, said Lao Tzu, I would like to respond to an interpellation that was submitted to me a week ago. It is signed by colleagues and Sturdy and several members of the linguistics section. Please note that the logical conclusions these colleagues draw, since the physical conditions on Venus were fatal for us, the conditions on Earth must conversely be fatal for the inhabitants of Venus. This implies that no rational reason could have motivated these apparently very rational beings to come to Earth, since nothing good would come of it for them. My esteemed colleagues, to the first part of this argument I can only say one thing, non sequitur. That doesn't follow from it. The esteemed colleagues believe that if they can't live on Venus, then the inhabitants of Venus can't live on Earth either. That doesn't follow from this premise. We cannot live in water, but fish with gills and lung respiration can live on land. I must express my regret that Professor Sturdy did not at least strengthen his party with a logician. A low murmur ran through the hall. The Chinese scholar continued with unshakable calm. The problem still remains to be solved as to whether nothing good could have actually happened on Earth for the inhabitants of Venus. Hoping that I am not boring the esteemed assembly, I would like to take the liberty of reciting an old parable by my great compatriot, the philosopher Chang-Tzu, to share. Two philosophers once stood on a small bridge that led over a clear stream and watched the fish playing. Then one said, "Just look how the little fish swim around in circles and splash. It is a pleasure for them." The second then replied, "How do you know what is a pleasure for a fish?" "And how do you know," replied the first, "you who are not me, that I don't know what gives fish pleasure?" I, dear colleagues, take the point of view of the second philosopher. I can only envy our esteemed colleague, Sturdy, for knowing so precisely what is pleasure for the inhabitants of Venus. A muffled laugh from the assembled crowd answered him. Lao Tzu put the map aside with Sturdy's objection and continued calmly and unperturbed. We are asked two questions. I say us, since I speak on behalf of the special section. We have combined these two questions and treated them as one. The core problem is whether one can launch a devastating attack from one planet against another, paralyzing life on it. We answer this question with a yes. One can. Some of the distinguished guests present had the pleasure of visiting our large beacon station. You will know that a year and a half ago we began construction there on a massive facility that allows us to hurl vast deuterons into space as concentrated electron charges. We intend to launch a load of fast deuterons onto Pallas, one of the small planets orbiting the Sun between Mars and Earth. The projectile must turn Pallas will completely turn to dust. The projectile palace completely turned to dust. We expect that this reaction will allow us to observe a small spiral nebula and will thus artificially create a model with which we can then study the formation of planetary systems. The project is already advanced enough to allow the attempt. I mention it, therefore, because it clearly and unequivocally proves the possibility of destroying one planet from another. Pallas only has a diameter of barely 40 kilometers, in contrast to Venus and Earth, which are 12,300 and 12,600 kilometers respectively. While the goal with Pallas is to shatter the small star into atoms, with a planet like Earth it would only be a matter of eliminating all life, and to do that it would be sufficient to irradiate it with a deuteron charge twice as large as the one we intend to fire at the planet Pallas. Therefore, we answer both questions posed to us with yes. The section whose views I am expressing is of the opinion that three courses of action are open to us. At the first, the idea occurred to us to compose a message in the magnetic language of report and send it to Venus with the help of a remote-guided rocket. Unfortunately, the vocabulary we possess in this language is insufficient and does not allow us to express what we wish to communicate to the inhabitants of Venus in such a document. The experiments conducted last night confirm this. One could, of course, also compose the message in one of the terrestrial languages, but it is still very uncertain whether the inhabitants of Venus would attempt to decipher it with the same amount of care and effort as we did with their report. Second, we can send the spacecraft to Venus, which has been conducting test flights for a year and has already completed the Earth-Moon-Earth flight without landing. As my esteemed colleagues know, I am thinking here of the Cosmocrator, which is scheduled to launch from Mars in the first months of next year. There is a third possibility, namely to launch a full deuteron load onto Venus from a beacon station. This approach would, of course, be the simplest and most radical. However, our special section considers such a course of action unjustified, simply because the so-called invasion of the Venusians to Earth is, for the time being, only a hypothesis that has not been confirmed by anything. The physicist fell silent. One of the scholars took advantage of the pause and asked whether it might not be possible to use the electronic brain to decide this key question. Unfortunately, that is not possible, Lao Tzu replied. Neither the electronic brain nor any other device has the ability to transform scant knowledge into productive knowledge. The Chinese man lowered his head. With that, I conclude the special section's report. He remained silent, did not yet sit down. He looked around the room, blinked a few times, and then said, as a member of the Translation Commission, I now wish to submit the following question to the Assembly for a vote. He looked at the piece of paper he held in his hand and read. The means at our disposal are so vast that we can act with complete freedom in terms of our technical capabilities. This means that the choice of our means of defense against the unknown entities is not hindered by any material concerns. Therefore, it shifts to the realm of moral evaluation and judgment. Should we be the first to attack in this situation, or should we strive for a peaceful solution to the conflict, even if such a course of action involves great difficulties or dangers? Lao Tzu let his hand with the piece of paper fall. The silence was broken by the soft ticking of a large chronometer hanging high above the heads of the members of the Presidium. I request that this question be put to a vote. I know that we are not being authorized to make such a decision, but I am convinced that humanity will pay attention to our views. That is all I have to say. The chairman declared that the Presidium had taken note of the special section's report, thanked it for its work, and at the same time, during the further deliberations, presented the motion read out by Professor Lao Tzu for discussion. Since no amendments were proposed, a vote was taken on both options. It was now almost 3 o'clock in the morning. The clouds, which had previously been brighter than the sky, were darkening. Behind the high windows of the hall, the boundary between heaven and earth was visible in the east, a deep crack framed by violet mists. The chairman, while speaking to his secretary, never took his eyes off the illuminated screen of the voting machine. When the counter confirmed that everyone had voted, he rose. 76 votes were cast for a peaceful solution to the conflict. The decision is, of course, not the final one, but that is not the point at the moment. Humanity has lived on Earth for approximately 800,000 years. During a past rich in hardship and suffering, generation after generation learned not only to control the forces of nature, but also to direct social forces and achieve peaceful cooperation between peoples. However, it is not our destiny to rest now and be content with what we have achieved. Right on the threshold of this new era, there was the first contact between human civilization and an extraterrestrial one. A sentence of annihilation was pronounced upon us. What should we do? Should we respond to the threat emanating from another planet with a single blow that destroys the attackers? We could do this all the more easily and unhindered, since we are dealing with beings that are completely different from ourselves, to whom we can attribute neither human feelings and emotions nor intellectual abilities in our sense. And yet, faced with a choice between war and peace, we have chosen peace. In this decision, I see the firm bond that connects humanity to the universe. The era in which we considered Earth a chosen celestial body above us, above all others, is over. We know that in the immensity of space, billions of worlds similar to ours orbit. What does it matter that the forms of active existence existing on them, which we call life, are unknown to us? We humans consider ourselves neither better nor worse than the other inhabitants of the universe. It cannot be denied that our decision involves a risk, tremendous effort, and danger that cannot yet be foreseen. Nevertheless, we are of one mind. We, the scientists, like all members of human society, serve the community. We are equals among equals, but something has been granted to us more abundantly, more generously than to the others of responsibility. Let us accept it, conscious of our duty to the whole world. The chairman was silent for a while. The pale violet glow of early dawn penetrated the window panes. In the distance, on the edge of the city, which could be seen from the height of the tower house, a dark ruby-red glow slowly rose in the eastern sky. I will then read out the list of voters, whom I asked to remain in the room. We must immediately begin preparing the report on our work, which is to be presented to the Supreme Scientific Council tomorrow, actually today, since the new day is already dawning. Before that, however, I would like to ask everyone gathered here a question. Is it possible that the decision will be made to send the spacecraft not to Mars as originally planned, but to Venus? Therefore, I would like to know who among the present wishes to participate in such an expedition. A dull shuffling of armchairs could be heard, as if everyone had agreed. The assembled scientists did not use the voting machines, but rose from their seats, one row after another, until the entire hall was in motion. Amidst these many pairs of eyes directed at him, the chairman, who had also risen, let his gaze glide from one face to the other, amazed at how everyone, old and young, filled with the same feeling, became similar to one another in that moment. His lips trembled barely noticeably. "I knew it," he whispered. Then he drew himself up tall, to be dignified, to look these people in the eye, and said loudly, "Thank you, colleagues." He turned around as if looking behind his back for someone, but there was no one there. Only the faint glow of the fading night fell through the high windows. The chairman returned to the table, closed the large book with both hands, in which all those who had requested to speak were entered, and said, "With this I close the last meeting of the Translation Committee." As they left the hall, the scholars pursued in the aisle, between the rows of chairs, and formed lively groups for discussion. All those who were to participate in drafting the report gathered around the presidium table. Finally, the large hall emptied. The last of those leaving turned off the light. The dawn glowed into the darkness of the vast space. The heavy, low-hanging clouds dispersed, and in the dark blue sky a distant spark began to shine, a star of such pure and strong brilliance that the window mullions cast faint shadows into the depths of the hall, and blurry outlines of empty rows of chairs and small tables became visible in the grey dawn. It was Venus, indicating the sunrise. Suddenly a fiery gold-rimmed cloud glowed. The motionless spark faded more and more until it disappeared in the dazzling brilliance of the new day.